Hi guys, welcome to your Kingdom Plantae video notes. Now this is the third set of notes in our theme that we're in, and these notes are pretty heavy in terms of the content that they cover, but just go ahead and take your time, pause where you need to, draw diagrams where you need to. So let's review. Unicellular we know is single-celled, multicellular has more than one cell. We know prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, so the question is, what are plants? Plants are eukaryotes. All right, so let's talk briefly about plant cells and their organelles. So a plant cell has a cell wall and a chloroplast. Obviously, they have many other organelles too, but those are the two that make them very different from animal cells, and they do a process called photosynthesis. When we talk about chloroplasts and chlorophyll, remember that chloroplasts are the membrane-bound organelles that contain chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is in the chloroplast, and this is what's really active during photosynthesis. And here's just another view at some of the plant cell organelles. So now we're getting into some new materials. So when we talk about types of plant cells, there's three major types of plant cells we'll discuss. So there's parenchyma cells, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. They're kind of fun to say, but they're pretty long words. So the parenchyma cells are the most flexible. They're found in leaves, green stems, fruits, roots. These are very flexible cells. The collenchyma cells, those support those surrounding stems, especially in young and developing plants, and they're also what connects the leaf blade to the stem. So long strands of celery are examples of collenchyma, which you see over here in this picture. So sclerenchyma, on the other hand, those cells actually lack cytoplasm, and they help provide support and transport. So those are in tree bark, seed coats, nutshells. These cells are very hard. And here's just another look at those types of cells. So you see the cross-section at the top, and then you see the longitudinal section at the bottom. So if I were you, I'd take a minute, just pause this, and kind of examine these different types of cells. When we talk about plant tissues, there's also several types of plant tissues. So tissues themselves can consist of one or more types of the plant cells that we just discussed. There's four types that you need to know. There's meristematic, dermal, vascular, and ground tissue. And this picture to the right shows a little bit of those there, but we'll get into that a little more here. So when we talk about meristematic tissues, meristems themselves are rapidly dividing cells. And within that, there's three types. You're probably starting to see why I said this was going to have a lot of information. So there's apical meristems, intercalary meristems, and lateral meristems. So the apical meristems are the shoot and the tip. This is the primary growth. This is where plants increase in length. And you can see that in the picture down here. Your intercalary meristems are the stem itself. This is why when you cut your grass, it still grows. It's not like you cut it once and it's done growing. It keeps growing. And your lateral meristems, on the other hand, are things like your roots and your trunk. These are secondary growth. They're going to increase in width as well. As you know, trees don't just grow up, they also grow wider. So if you've ever seen trees that have like a rope or wire or something tied around it, eventually it ends up cutting into the bark because the tree's expanding and growing. So when we talk about dermal tissues, there's also four types of dermal tissues. So there's something called the cuticle, stomata, trichomes, and root hairs. The cuticle itself prevents water loss. The stomata then is the small openings that do allow gas to pass through and water in transpiration. That's where it goes through. But the cuticle itself protects the leaf. Trichomes, on the other hand, are hair-like projections, and they protect the plant. They give it a fuzzy appearance. If you've ever looked at the underside of leaves or sometimes on the stems, you'll see these. And then root hairs, those increase the surface area to help take in greater amounts of materials. So if roots have lots of root hairs, they're absorbing much more from the ground. And here's just a closer look at stomata. So all these little mouths are stomata that you see. And here's a look at those dermal tissues we just discussed. So as you notice, it's a cross-section of a leaf. So you see the cuticle is this whole part on the top and the bottom. You see your stomata is here, and then you also see all of those other cells in between. So we have mesophyll cells, air space, we have vascular cells. All of those cells make up what you typically just see as a leaf. Now when we get to vascular tissue, there are two kinds. So there's xylem and phloem. So I have a little method for you to remember this. So xylem is tissue that carries water and minerals. It's unidirectional, meaning one direction, and these are actually what ends up being rings on a tree. Now phloem, on the other hand, transports sugar. So these are going to move bidirectional, so two ways. Now the way I think about it is water, right, and minerals, so TUVWX, those go together, and then I just think of sugar as PS, like you're writing a note, PS. So phloem and sugar go together, xylem and water go together. When we talk about ground tissue, these consist of all plant cells, but it's mainly parenchyma. There are some parenchyma and sclerenchyma, but it's mainly the parenchyma cells. Their major functions are things like photosynthesis and metabolism, storage and support, and they also produce toxins and oils to protect some plants. Now let's get into the plant structure. So this time, now we're going to start talking about the roots, stems, leaves, and seeds. So roots themselves are the first structure to grow out of the seed, and we're actually going to be growing some plants, so you will see this firsthand. The roots themselves take in water and dissolve nutrients, and there's two types of root systems that we're going to talk about. So there's something called a taproot system, which is just a very thick root with a few small lateral branching roots, and then there's a fibrous root system, which has numerous branching roots. They're all about the same size, even though they do have a central point. So if we look at this picture up here, you'll see fibrous root is the first plant, and then taproot is the second plant. And actually, some foods that you might eat are actually taproot, like a carrot. The stems, on the other hand, those are above ground, and those are going to support the plant's leaves and reproductive structures. They have some other functions too, though. They transport those water and substances, the xylem and the phloem, but they also store food and water. Leaves also have two major structures you need to know, the blade and the petiole. So it's super tiny, but you can see it up here in this picture. The blade is the flat part of the leaf, and the petiole is kind of the little part that attaches the leaf to the rest of the plant. Now, most leaves have the same internal structure, and like we talked about when we did discuss the water cycle, they're important in transpiration and gas exchange, which we know from photosynthesis. So the epidermis is where those pores are, and those pores are the stomata. So water is going to evaporate from the inside, exit the stomata, and as you know or hopefully remember, that process is called transpiration. Here's also just some leaf characteristics. Hopefully we'll get a chance to do this fun little leaf assignment where you actually kind of go on a scavenger hunt and you look for all the different types of leaves, but leaves come in many different shapes and structures and arrangements. Seeds are also a very major plant structure. So these are important for the reproduction of plants. They contain an embryo, but they also have nutrients for that embryo, and they are covered with a protective coat. So these features enable seeds to survive harsh environmental conditions. Some seeds, for example, must have a forest fire, for example, for them to even start to germinate. So they have to be very durable at times. Also, you need to know that it's only when favorable conditions exist that they sprout. So for example, some birds, they eat berries or fruit and there's seeds inside. Well, when they poop, the seeds are released, but those seeds will then germinate. They're not going to germinate inside the bird's stomach. They're going to wait until it's favorable and they're somewhere where they can actually sprout. Now, monocots and eudicots, so these are relating to seeds and how they develop. So cot as in cotyledon, which is the little leaf you see here developing. So mono, as you could guess, mono meaning one, there's one cotyledon, and eudicots, there's two. There can also be more than two, but we're just going to go with two. They also have some key characteristics. So monocots, their leaves have veins that look parallel. They have vascular bundles in a complex arrangement. Really important to note, their floral parts are in multiples of 3, and they have a fibrous root system. Now, eudicots, on the other hand, have branched veins, like you see here. Their vascular bundles are in a ring. This time, though, the floral parts are in multiples of 4 or 5, and they have a taproot. Next up is the fun stuff that plants do. So plants actually can respond to things, and they do have hormones that trigger things as well. So there's 4 major types of hormones that we're going to talk about. So there's auxin, gibberellins, ethylene, and cytokinins. Now, these affect things like cell division, growth, cell differentiation, even the ripening of fruits. So auxin, for example, is the growth rate of roots, stems, and leaves. Gibberellins helps with seed growth and the elongation of cells, which is as that seed's growing, and it also causes a height increase. Ethylene is the only gaseous hormone, which is important to note, and this is with fruit ripening. If you've never done this before, let's say you have one banana left at home and it's super ripe, and you go to the store and they only have green bananas, and you're like, ugh, I really need bananas for lunch this week. Well, if you keep that ripe banana by your bananas that aren't ripe, it's going to ripen them faster than if they were simply just by themselves. And finally, the cytokinins, these stimulate mitosis and cytokinesis, which we know is important for cell division, which is another important part of the plant growth. There's also responses that plants can do. So there's nastic responses, which cause an independent movement. I'm sure you're all aware of a Venus flytrap. But there's also tropic responses, and these are just a plant growing in response to some sort of external stimulus. Now there's three major types we'll discuss here, and these will be included in our scavenger hunt, so hopefully you'll see a little bit of this. But we have phototropism, so that's here, growing towards a light. If you have any houseplants at home, you know that if they're in a window, you have to rotate them if you want them to grow straight because they're going to lean all their leaves towards the light. Gravitropism is going towards gravity. So if you knock something over, maybe you've seen a tree somewhere where it got knocked over, but it has a little bend and then keeps growing, that's an example of gravitropism. Thigmotropism then is turning or bending in response to the touch of a solid surface, and this is really, really common in vines. Next up then, we're going to talk about evolution and adaptations. So when we compare present-day plants to algae, they have some things in common. So they have cell walls of cellulose, they have chlorophyll that's used in photosynthesis, similar ribosomal RNA genes, and they store food as starch. Now there's three types of plant groups. So we have non-vascular, seedless vascular, and seed-producing vascular, and these are the order in which they also evolved. So here's another look. If I were you, I'd pause this. You might want to copy this down or take a picture of it, but this is a very important cladogram of how plants evolved. So we're going to start with non-vascular plants. So there's some distinguishing characteristics with these plants. When you think of non-vascular, you should think about mosses. They have structures very similar to leaves, but they're not quite as developed as some of our common leafy plants. And they are the most primitive of land plants. Seedless vascular plants evolved next. Now these have roots, stems, and they do have some leaf-like structures. They also have vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, which is why they're called vascular plants. But they have a sporophyte that produces roots and a thick underground stem, and this is how they reproduce. So they're almost kind of like fungi, a little bit of a cross, because they do have these spore-type seeds that they produce, but they're not actual seeds. Next then is our vascular seed plants, and there's 5 divisions that we're going to talk about. So these ones, each one may have something that's familiar to you. We'll see. So division cycadophytes, these evolved before plants with flowers. Their natural habitat is tropics, subtropics. These are things that you probably saw in the Jurassic Park movie or that they tried to represent. The division Cnidophytes, these can actually live 1,500 to 2,000 years, and ephedrine is naturally found in these plants as well. Ginkgophyta, there's only one species left in this division, and it's Ginkgo biloba, and it's also it's an extract, kind of a thing that you can buy at the grocery store too. And they have small fan-shaped leaves. And there's 2 more. So Coniferophyta, these ones have structures that are in cones. So they have male and female cones on different branches, and they have a wax-like coating called cutin that reduces water loss. If you've ever felt pine needles, you've felt this. And finally, ANTHOPHYTA. So these first appeared in the fossil record 130 million years ago, and here's the way they're classified, back to that monocot, eudicot. And they were also the first flowering plants in this division. Next up then, annuals, biennials, and perennials. These are probably terms you've heard before. Annuals die every year, biennials have a lifespan of 2 years, and perennials live for several years and produce flowers and seeds yearly. Next up then is angiosperms versus gymnosperms. Now angiosperms have enclosed seeds, and they're known as fruiting or flowering plants, And gymnosperms are known as naked. A good way to remember this, you get naked at the gym if you're taking a shower. And that is all I have for your notes.